There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't weep in doorways or beg for witness. It moves quietly through a house, through the kitchen at 4 in the morning, through the garden in October when the last tomatoes have gone soft on the vine. It sits in the chair by the window and watches the road. Not waiting exactly. That word implies hope. This is something older than hope, something that has forgotten what it was waiting for. Nora Calvert had lived on the Sundown Ranch for 51 years. She had buried a husband, raised 2 sons who left for cities that swallowed them whole, and outlasted 3 droughts, 1 flood, and a wildfire that took the South Barn and 6 horses she'd named after saints. She kept a ledger. Not for money, the ranch barely broke even most years, but for days. Each morning she wrote a single line, what the weather did, what she ate, whether anyone had come. Most pages ended the same way. No one today. I know this because she showed me the ledger. Not right away. Not even in the first week. She showed it to me on a Tuesday in late October, when the light came sideways through the kitchen window and turned her white hair to something almost golden, and she set it on the table between us like a confession she'd been holding for 10 years. I'm going to tell you what happened when Dak Runningwater came back. But first, I need to tell you what the ranch looked like before he did, because places hold grief the way soil holds water. Long after the surface looks dry, it's still down there, still moving, still capable of making things grow or drown depending on the season. This is a story about both. My name is Clem Hargrove, and I keep a log, always have. My father kept one, his mother kept one before him, and somewhere in a shoebox in my truck there's a composition notebook with entries going back to 1987 that I haven't looked at in 6 years because the grief in it is still too fresh. I mention this because it matters, not for vanity, but because the habit of writing things down taught me to notice things other people skim past. Gestures, silences. The way a person pours coffee tells you more about their internal, whether than anything they'll say before noon. I arrived at the Sundown Ranch on a Thursday in mid-October. The drive from Flagstaff had taken me longer than expected because I'd stopped twice. Once for a family of javelinas crossing Route 89, and once because the light on the Mogollon Rim did something I'd never seen it do before. Went deep copper orange at 11 in the morning from the wildfire smoke drifting up from the south, and I sat on the hood of my truck for 20 minutes just watching it until a semi honked me back to the present. I was there on a job, simple enough on paper. My cousin Delia worked for an agricultural extension office out of Prescott, and she'd gotten a call from a neighbor, the nearest neighbor, 12 miles east, that Nora Calvert's south fence line had been down for 6 weeks and her cattle were drifting. The neighbor, a man named Hoskins, had patched it twice already, but at 73 himself he couldn't keep doing it. Delia knew I was between jobs, knew I could work with my hands, and knew I owed her a favor from 3 years back that I'd rather not detail here. So she sent me with a truck full of T-posts, wire, and a casserole dish she'd made herself because Delia cannot send anyone anywhere without food. What she did not tell me, or perhaps did not fully understand, was the particular quality of isolation at the Sundown Ranch. You feel it before you see the house. The road in is a dirt track, 1.5 miles from the county road, lined on both sides by scrub juniper and ocotillo. The cattle guard at the entrance had grass growing up through its rails, which told me something. The gate beyond it was wired open rather than properly latched, which told me something more. And the fence, even from a distance, before I'd gotten to the specific section that was down, looked like something that had been repaired so many times by so many different people over so many different decades that it had lost any consistent character. It was a fence held together by compromise and stubbornness, which, as I'd come to understand over the next several weeks, was a fair description of everything on the property. The house itself was low and wide, adobe with a tin roof that had been painted dark red sometime in the 1990s, judging by its current state of peeling. The porch ran the full width of the front face, and there were 2 chairs on it, both facing the road. One had a blanket folded over the arm. The other had nothing on it at all and had, for reasons I couldn't articulate, the particular look of a chair that was never used. Nora Calvert was standing on the porch when I pulled up. She was smaller than I'd expected. Not frail, there's a difference, and she was absolutely not frail, but compact in the way of someone whose body has been doing hard work for decades and has shed everything unnecessary. Her hair was white and pinned up roughly at the back. She wore canvas pants, a flannel shirt the color of river mud, and boots that had seen things. She was watching me with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who has no reason to rush to conclusions. I got out of the truck and introduced myself. She looked at me for a long moment before responding, then said, "Delia's cousin." "Yes, ma'am." "She made a casserole." I looked back at the truck. "How did you?" "Because Delia always makes a casserole." She turned and went inside, leaving the door open behind her. I stood there for a moment, then figured that was as close to an invitation as I was likely to get. The interior of the house was clean in the way that takes real effort to maintain, not the reflexive tidiness of someone with help, but the deliberate, daily practice tidiness of someone who understands that order is a form of dignity. The kitchen was large, running along the back of the house with a window above the sink that looked out toward the south pasture. The table was old, scarred pine, with 4 chairs around it, though it was immediately apparent that only one of those chairs was regularly used. The others had a slightly different quality of stillness. Not neglect exactly, but the stillness of objects that have been relieved of their purpose. She put a kettle on without asking if I wanted anything, and gestured at the table. "Sit." I sat. I noticed she didn't sit across from me, but at the head of the table, at a slight angle, which put her facing both me and the window simultaneously. Control of the sightline. I noted it without judgment. When you've been living alone on remote property for long enough, you develop spatial habits that keep you from being caught off guard. We talked about the fence. She was clear and specific about which sections needed the most work, and she'd made a rough sketch on the back of an envelope, not labeled exactly, but functionally accurate. She knew her land the way you know the rooms of a house you've lived in for 50 years, not by thinking about it, but by having moved through it in the dark. She was not warm initially. I want to be honest about that. She was courteous, precise, occasionally dry. When I asked about her cattle, she said there were 38 head and then added without inflection, down from 212. I didn't ask about that. Some numbers need to sit before you can approach them. I stayed in the bunkhouse, which was clean and functional, and had a small wood stove that Nora had, apparently, laid a fire in before my arrival without telling me. I found this out when I tried to build one myself, and noticed the paper and kindling were already perfectly arranged. I sat on the bunk for a while after I noticed that and felt something I couldn't name precisely, something that was a cross between gratitude and sadness. I started on the fence the next morning. It took 4 days to work through the worst sections, and I worked alone, which was my preference. The land was quiet in the way high desert is quiet, not silent, but layered, full of wind and bird and the distant sound of cattle, occasional coyotes at dusk. But underneath all of it, a fundamental, pressing, almost physical silence that you either come to peace with or you don't. I came to peace with it on the 2nd day. By the 3rd day, I was grateful for it. Nora appeared at the fence line twice. Once to bring coffee in a thermos, which she set on a post without ceremony and left. Once to look at a stretch of repair I'd completed, walk along it for 50 yards or so testing tension with her hand, and nod once. That was all. But I noticed both times that she came on foot rather than in the battered ranch truck I'd seen parked by the barn, and both times she came from a direction that wasn't the house. She was out doing things, checking on cattle, probably, or the water tanks, or the windmill I'd heard grinding to the southeast. She was not, as I had half worried she might be, simply sitting in the house watching the road. Still, I worried a little. On my 4th evening, I was cleaning up in the bunkhouse when I heard the truck start. I looked out the window and saw Nora drive the full length of the driveway to the county road, stop, and sit there. The truck didn't move for about 10 minutes. Then she drove back. She did this, I would later learn, every evening at dusk. Had been doing it for years. She didn't have a clear explanation for why. When I finally asked, gently, she looked at me sideways and said, "You don't always know you're waiting until you stop." I wrote that in my log that night. I've kept it ever since. The fence work extended into a 2nd week, because I found more problems than I'd initially scoped. A section near the northeast corner where a wash had undercut the posts. A spot near the old hay barn where something, probably elk, had pushed through repeatedly, and the wire was bent beyond reasonable salvage. I called Delia and told her I'd be longer. She asked, with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to put thoughts in your head, how Nora was doing. "She's doing," I said. "That's not nothing." "No. It's not." By the end of the 2nd week, Nora had started eating dinner with me. Not initially. The first week I ate in the bunkhouse, and she left food outside the door each evening in a covered pot with a silence and precision that I found both touching and slightly heartbreaking. But on the 8th day she appeared at the bunkhouse door at 6 o'clock and said, "Table set," and walked back toward the house, and I understood that to be an instruction rather than an invitation, which somehow made it easier to accept. She cooked well, not elaborately. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, hadn't been in years, but with the confidence of someone who has been cooking for hard-working people in cold weather for decades. Stews that stuck to your ribs, bread that was heavier than it looked. Once a bean dish with dried chilies that she apologized for unnecessarily, because it was one of the best things I'd eaten in 2 years. We talked slowly, the way you do when you're not in a hurry and don't have performance anxiety about conversation. She told me about the ranch in small pieces. Her husband, Earl, had died of a heart attack in the East Pasture in 2007. The 2 sons, Boyd and Ricky, had left before that. Boyd was in Denver doing something in finance that Nora described with the carefully neutral tone of someone who doesn't understand and has stopped trying. Ricky was in Portland. They called on birthdays. Sometimes, she said this without apparent bitterness, and somehow that was worse. She told me about the 212 cattle, how they'd dwindled through drought years and low beef prices, and the expense of hay when the grass failed. She'd sold rather than watch them starve, she said. You make the choice that keeps them from suffering, even if it costs you everything you built. She said this looking out the window. The south pasture was dark by then, just the pale shapes of the remaining 38 against the last of the light. I asked on the 9th evening about the empty chair on the porch, the one with nothing on it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that was Earl's chair. He liked to sit there evenings and watch the road come in. I waited. I sit in mine, he sits in his. A pause. Don't tell me that's strange. I won't, I said. And I meant it absolutely. It was on the 11th day, a Tuesday, cool and clear, the first hard frost of the season having come overnight, that I found the old camp. I wasn't looking for it. I was scouting the northwest fence line, the last section I had left to assess, when I came over a low rise and found myself looking down into a shallow draw that was sheltered from the north by a limestone outcrop. There was a fire ring there, old but clearly maintained, cleaned out, ringed with rocks that had been arranged with intentionality. A few feet from it, a rusted coffee can on a flat rock, and beyond it, carved into the face of the limestone, a series of marks. I'm not an expert in such things. I know enough to know when I'm looking at something I shouldn't casually interpret. The marks were old, the limestone lichen had grown across some of them, but others looked fresher or at least clean, the lines clear and intentional. Not vandalism, not graffiti, something else. I stood there for a while, not touching anything, trying to understand what I was looking at and mostly failing. When I told Nora about it at dinner, she went very still. You know that place, I said, not a question. Yes. Who made those marks? She picked up her coffee cup with both hands, held it without drinking. A man named Dak, she said at last. He worked here long time ago. How long? He left 10 years ago this November. She set the cup down. He was Apache, from Sibq, I think, though he didn't talk much about it. Earl hired him in, 2003 or 2004. We were still running at full capacity then. He was good with horses, better with cattle than most men I've known. A pause. Better with people too, though he didn't always show it in ways people recognized as kindness. She got up and took her plate to the sink. What happened? I asked. She stood with her back to me, looking out the kitchen window at the dark. He left, she said. After Earl died, I think he thought. She stopped. I think he thought the place couldn't hold without Earl at the center of it, and he was probably right, but I stayed. You stayed, I said. I always stay. She said it simply without pride or grievance, just fact. I thought about the drive to the county road at dusk, the 2 chairs on the porch, the camp in the draw with the fire ring maintained, and the coffee can on the flat rock. I didn't sleep well that night, not because of anything I could name precisely, but my log from that evening ends with this. Some absences are so large they become structural. She's built her whole routine around the shape of what's not here. The question is whether that's grief or faith. Maybe it's both. The next morning, a truck I didn't recognize came up the drive. I was on the porch with my coffee when it came around the last bend in the road. A dark green pickup, older model, moving slowly, the way people move when they're not sure of their welcome. It stopped 10 yards from the porch and idled for a moment before the engine went off. The man who got out was somewhere in his late 40s, maybe 50, dark hair, mostly gray at the temples. He was lean, not tall, with the particular economy of movement that comes from a life of physical labor. He had a duffel bag over one shoulder. He stood by the truck and looked at the house and didn't say anything. I looked at him. He looked at me. Then he looked past me, toward the door, and I understood, without any further context, exactly who he was. I also understood, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that Nora had not been driving to the county road every evening because she had given up waiting. She had been driving to the road every evening because she had not. I did not announce him. I want to be clear about that, because afterward I questioned whether I should have handled it differently. Gone inside, said something to Nora, given her some kind of preparation. But in the moment, standing on the porch with my coffee going cold in my hand, I understood instinctively that what was about to happen needed to happen at its own pace, without a stage manager. Some things you can't choreograph without ruining them. He stood by the truck. I sat back in the chair and looked out at the south pasture and let the silence do its work. It was maybe 3 minutes before the screen door opened behind me. Nora came out with her own coffee, the way she did every morning after I'd been there long enough to become part of the routine. She had her eyes down on her cup. She took 2 steps toward her chair before she looked up. She stopped. The cup stayed level. That was the thing I noticed first. The cup stayed perfectly level. Whatever was happening inside her, her hands didn't shake. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, was waiting, I realized, for something specific. Permission, maybe, or just proof that she was still there. "Dak," she said. "Mrs. Calvert." His voice was low, a little roughened. The voice of someone who hadn't used it much for social purposes in a while. "You look terrible," she said. He looked down at himself briefly, then back up. "Yes, ma'am." "Sit down." She gestured at the step. Not the empty chair, not Earl's chair, the step. And I thought, she knows exactly what she's doing. She's giving him a place that doesn't carry a history. He sat on the step. She lowered herself into her chair. I considered making myself scarce and decided against it, partly because I wasn't sure the dynamic would survive a sudden absence, and partly, I'll admit, because I needed to see this. Not for voyeurism, for understanding something I'd been circling for 12 days without being able to name. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow that I hadn't noticed from the truck. His hands were the kind that have spent decades doing difficult things, knuckle-scarred, thick in the joints, but precise when they moved, like tools that have been broken improperly. "Where have you been?" Nora said, not angry. "Not particularly." She asked it the way you ask someone where a thing has been when you've been looking for it, and you're mostly just relieved it exists. "All over," he said. Then, "Colorado mostly, worked cattle up there for a while, horses, different ranches." "Did you work your way back on purpose?" A pause, not at first. She made a sound that might have been something like a laugh, though it was too spare to be sure. "When did you start?" He looked at his hands. "About 2 years ago." She nodded slowly. "What took the other 8? The question lay there between them, not hostile but not soft either. Real. The kind of question that has been waiting a long time for an articulation and knows it deserves an honest answer. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought he might not answer at all. Then he said, "After Earl died, I thought you'd sell. I thought the whole thing would go. I didn't want to be here when it did. I couldn't." He stopped, started again. "I couldn't watch another thing I cared about disappear while I was standing next to it." Nora looked at him. "So you left first?" "Yes." "To avoid the loss?" "Yes." "And the thing you were trying to avoid losing is still here?" He looked at the house, the pasture, the chairs. He looked for a long moment at the empty one. I saw his jaw tighten and then release. "Yes," he said again, very quietly. Nora drank her coffee. The morning was still and cool, a light wind moving through the junipers, and one of the cattle was lowing somewhere in the south pasture, that low, resonant sound that carries a long way in thin air. "I maintained the fire ring," she said abruptly. He looked at her. "I saw it when I drove in. I cleaned it out every spring, put the coffee can back when the wind took it." She said this without sentimentality, reporting facts. "I didn't know if you were coming back, I just maintained it." I had to look away for a moment. I looked at the juniper. I looked at the frost-whitened grass at the edge of the porch. I held my coffee cup with both hands and tried to be invisible, which is a skill I developed over years of observing people in the midst of things that belonged to them. I found the markers, he said. New ones, someone added marks to the limestone. Nora said nothing. Was that you? Earl taught me some of them, she said. He learned years before you came. When the first man who worked here, that was Nativo, this was in the 90s, when Nativo showed him a few, Earl practiced them until he had them right, and then he kept going back to the place. Carved them as he learned them. A pause. After you left, I went back and finished learning them, from what Earl had started. Dak looked at her with an expression I found difficult to describe. Not quite surprise, not quite grief. Something between reverence and apology. That wasn't your... It wasn't presumptuous, she said with a quiet firmness. It was honoring something. If you have a problem with it, you can tell me what's wrong and I'll listen. But I don't think you do. He was quiet then. No, I don't. I excused myself then, as gently and unobtrusively as I could, saying something about getting back to the fence. Nora acknowledged me with a slight nod. Dak looked up briefly. He had, I realized, been peripherally aware of me the whole time without directly addressing me, which showed a particular quality of attention, and gave me a small nod in return. I worked the northwest section all morning and tried to focus on the fence. It was better than I expected. The posts were set deeper than in some of the other sections, and the wire, though old, had good tension. Whoever had run it originally had known what they were doing. There were repair patches here and there, different vintages of wire, and at one point I found what I was fairly sure was a section that had been restrung comparatively recently. Within the last 10 years, maybe, with care and precision. I ran my hand along it and thought about who might have done it. I had lunch alone. When I came back in the late afternoon to return tools to the barn, both of them were in the south pasture. They were at least 200 yards from me, too far to read expressions or hear words, but I could see their posture and their movement. They were walking the fence line together. Nora pointed at something. Dak crouched down to look at it. He stood. They walked on. It was ordinary and unremarkable, and it made my chest ache in a way I hadn't anticipated. That evening at dinner, there were 3 plates on the table. Nora said nothing about it. I sat in my usual place. Dak sat in the chair across from me. Nora sat at the head. The food was the same stew she'd made the previous evening, stretched with more liquid and what I suspected was an emergency potato. She had not gone to town, had not had time or advance notice to do anything elaborate. She'd simply added a chair and a plate and made what she had work. There is a kind of grace in that, a domestic improvisation that comes from decades of managing with whatever is available. And I thought of the casserole Delia had sent, and understood that the compulsion to feed people is sometimes the most honest form of love available. We ate in something that was not quite silence and not quite conversation. Dak had questions about the fence work, how much had been done, what I'd found, and I answered them directly. He knew the property's weak points better than I did, which became apparent as we talked. He could name sections before I described them, which section had the undercut posts, which corner had the elk problem. Nora ate and watched and said very little, but the quality of her silence was different from the silence I'd been eating with for the previous 11 evenings. Before, her silence had the texture of space that used to be occupied, a held breath, an absence shaped like a person. Now it had a different quality. I kept trying to find the right word for it and finally settled on restored, not repaired. Not the same as before. Restored in the conservation sense, returned to a functional condition with the damage still visible, with the history of what had happened still legible. After dinner, Dak did the dishes without being asked. Nora watched him from the table with the careful, sideways attention of someone trying to ascertain whether this is real. I went back to the bunkhouse and wrote in my log for a long time. There are things I wrote in that night's entry that I won't repeat here because they're too personal to me. They have to do with my own father's death and the particular geography of absence and return, and that's not this story. But there's one passage I'll share. He left to avoid the grief of watching it all disappear. She stayed and watched it all disappear anyway. And she maintained the fire ring. That's the whole difference between them, summed up in one image. She maintained it not knowing if he was coming. He came back not knowing if it would still be there. That's what faith looks like when there's no religion propping it up. Just the daily practice of keeping something ready. The next morning I woke before light and went out to start the truck for warmth, and I saw, from the bunkhouse window, that there was a fire in the draw. Small orange, a column of smoke going straight up in the still air. I left it alone. I made my own coffee in the bunkhouse. I waited until the sun was up before going to the barn for tools. The thing I hadn't accounted for was how complicated the return would become. It started on the third day after Dak arrived. I was working on the last section of fence when Nora's truck came fast down the dirt track to where I was, too fast for the track, trailing dust, and she braked hard and got out without fully stopping. "Ricky called," she said. I waited. "He's coming." She said it like she wasn't sure whether it was good or bad news, like the classification system she'd been using for the past several years didn't have a clear category for this information. "He saw on the county register that I'd had a contractor come in to do fence work. He apparently checks it." She stopped. I didn't know he checked it. I tried to parse what I was seeing on her face. The word I finally landed on was exposed. "When?" I asked. 3 days. He's driving from Portland." "Okay," I kept my voice level. "Is that a problem?" She looked at the fence. "He doesn't know about Dak," she said. "He left before Dak came. He doesn't know anything about him." A pause. "He's going to think." "He's going to think what the evidence suggests," I said carefully. "That there's a man here who knows the ranch and is helping." She looked at me. "Ricky always thought I was wasting time here. Couldn't understand why I didn't sell after Earl died. He and Boyd both thought I was." She pressed her lips together. "They thought it was unhealthy to stay. And now he's coming to check on you." "Now he's coming," she said. The way she said it told me everything I needed to know about the emotional complexity of a grown child who leaves and then, years later, feels guilty enough to show up, but shows up still on his own timeline at a moment that is convenient for him. Not in the winters when she's alone and the pipes freeze. Not in the drought summers when the water tanks need constant maintenance. Now. When a contractor has appeared on the county register and unsettled whatever mental image he's been keeping of his mother, safely out of sight. I don't say this harshly. Guilt is a complicated motivator, and its logic rarely runs on straight lines. But Nora had been here for 10 years of no one today entries in her ledger, and the first time the ledger changed, the people who'd been absent wanted to be part of the change. That evening, the three of us ate dinner in a different configuration of silence than we'd had the night before. Dak knew, from a brief exchange I'd witnessed between him and Nora in the afternoon, that Ricky was coming. His posture at the table was careful, not defensive exactly, but prepared, the set of a man who has spent his life being the person in a room who has to justify his presence before he's opened his mouth. Nora ate with the focused practicality of someone doing mental preparation. I ate and watched and wrote the scene in my head for the log. After dinner, when Dak had gone to check on the cattle and I was helping Nora clear the table, she said, without preamble, "I'm not going to apologize for him being here." "I wouldn't think that was a question," I said. "It will be," she rinsed a plate. "Ricky will frame it as a question by not asking it directly. That's how he operates. He'll be polite and a little stiff, and he'll keep glancing at Dak and not saying what he's thinking, and eventually it'll leak out sideways in something that sounds like concern for me." She set the plate in the rack. "And I'm going to have to resist the urge to explain myself, because I'm 74 years old and this is my land and I have nothing to explain." "Then don't explain." "I know," to pause, "I know. But knowing and doing are a considerable distance apart when it's your child." I thought about that. About how age distributes itself asymmetrically in a family, how a parent can be 74 and still feel, in the presence of a child, some residual pull toward justification. As if the years of authority are, in a child's presence, temporarily suspended, and you're back in some earlier arrangement, some older negotiation about who has standing and why. "He's coming because he was worried about you," I said. "That's real even if his timing is convenient." She looked at me, her expression was complicated. "Don't make excuses for him." "I'm not making excuses. I'm reading the evidence and giving you the most charitable interpretation. You don't have to use it." She almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come in the 2 weeks I'd known her, and it changed her face in a way that let me see, briefly, what she might have looked like at 40. "You sound like Earl," she said. "That was exactly the kind of thing Earl used to say." I didn't answer. There didn't seem to be anything appropriate to add to that. Ricky Calvert arrived 2.5 days later, mid-afternoon on a Thursday. He was in his late 40s, with Earl's height and Nora's coloring, and he'd come in a rented SUV from Flagstaff Airport, which told me he'd flown rather than driven. He was dressed in the careful, casual way of a man who has spent enough time in an office to lose the habit of working clothes and knows it, and is slightly self-conscious about it. Good jeans, a flannel that was too new to have the proper softness, boots that had never been used for their intended purpose. He hugged his mother on the porch in a way that was genuine but slightly stiff, the embrace of a man who loves someone and doesn't quite know how to be in the same physical space with them anymore, like a language you once spoke fluently that has gone rusty from disuse. Nora received it without pulling back, which I suspected was its own kind of discipline. He shook my hand and thanked me for the fence work. He was polite, efficient about it, the politeness of someone running through a checklist. And then he turned and saw Dak coming in from the pasture. The look on his face was involuntary. He couldn't have helped it. It lasted only a second or two before he composed himself, but in that second I saw surprise, assessment, and the specific uncertainty of a person who has pre-scripted a version of this trip that did not include this element. Nora introduced them in 2 sentences. She did not explain Dak's history with the ranch. She introduced him as a man who worked here, present tense, and let the fact of him stand on its own. Dak was formal and direct, the way he was when he was navigating territory that required precise social calibration, and shook Ricky's hand and said he'd be in the barn if anyone needed anything, and walked away. Ricky watched him go. "He just showed up?" he asked. "He came back," Nora said. "People do sometimes." The look he gave her then was one I recognized. It was the look of a grown child who is suddenly uncertain whether the version of their parent they've been maintaining in their head is actually accurate, or whether the real person has been living a more complicated and complete life than the simplified narrative allows for. He recovered quickly, went inside, said he'd help with dinner. I made myself useful in the barn. I should have left by then. My fence work was, strictly speaking, done. I'd completed the last section the morning before Ricky arrived, and any honest accounting of my responsibilities to Delia and to the job would have had me packing the truck and heading back to Flagstaff by that evening. I stayed for 2 reasons, and I want to be honest about both. The first was practical. There was a section of corral gate near the north barn that I'd noticed on my second day and kept meaning to mention to Nora. The hinge bracket was pulling from the post, and in another hard wind it was going to fail completely, and replacing a fallen gate is substantially harder than reinforcing a loose bracket while it's still standing. So there was real work to justify staying 1 more day. The second reason was that I didn't want to leave. And that's harder to justify and easier to admit. Ricky and Nora's first dinner together was not a disaster, but it had the quality of 2 people who haven't spoken the same language in a long time very carefully trying to be understood. He asked about the ranch operations with the gentle, slightly condescending care of someone who has decided the situation is probably worse than the person living it will admit. She answered with the precise, unembellished clarity of someone who has been doing this alone and needs no one's assessment of whether she's managing. Dak ate his dinner and was quiet. Ricky kept not quite looking at him, which was a more conspicuous behavior than simply looking. After dinner, Ricky asked to walk the property with Nora. They went out together and were gone for almost 2 hours, through the south pasture and around the back of the property where the old hay barn still stood, the one that had burned and been partially rebuilt, the one that still smelled, even now, of old smoke under the new wood. I know this because Nora told me afterward. I know what was said because she told me that too the next morning over coffee while Ricky was still asleep. She told it without drama, the way she told everything. He had asked at some point along the property line whether she'd thought about selling. She had said no. He had said, carefully, with what she acknowledged was genuine concern beneath the ill-advised framing, that it was a lot for one person, that she was 74, that the ranch was 47 miles from the nearest hospital. She had said, "I'm not alone." He had been quiet for a moment. Then, "You mean the contractor or you mean Dak?" She had said, "I mean Dak. The contractor's done Thursday." More quiet, they'd walked the length of the burned barn, the new wood silvering in the moonlight. Then Ricky had asked how long Dak had been there before. 4 years, she said. Before Dad died. Before and after. Another silence, then very carefully, and you don't think strange that he just left and now he's back. She said she'd stop to look at him then. At her son, who was 47 years old and lived in a city he'd adopted the way you adopt a foreign country, by learning its customs and eventually becoming, mostly, a native. She said she'd looked at him for a long moment in the dark and then said, "Ricky, have you ever left something you loved because you were afraid of losing it?" He hadn't answered immediately. She said his silence had a particular quality, the quality of a question hitting somewhere it wasn't expected to go. Then he said, yes. She hadn't asked him to say more, she just walked on. They'd come home and had tea in the kitchen, the two of them, and what had passed between them after that she kept for herself. I didn't press. But when she came in to tell me about it at 6 in the morning, standing at the bunkhouse door with her coffee, she looked different. Not lightened, that's the wrong word. More like someone who has set down a weight they've been carrying at a particular angle for so long, they didn't realize how much of their posture it had determined. "He's going to stay for the week," she said. "Good," I said. "It'll be awkward." "Yes. Dak is going to have to exist in the same space as Ricky's discomfort, and Ricky is going to have to manage his own reaction without me managing it for him." A pause. "And I'm going to have to resist the urge to smooth everything over, because I've been smoothing things over my entire adult life, and I'm tired." "You've earned the right to be tired," I said. "I've earned the right to be difficult if I want," she said. And she almost smiled again, the same brief, transformative expression as before, gone before you could quite hold it. I fixed the corral gate that morning. Dak helped, passing tools and holding the post while I drilled, and we worked in the easy silence of two people who have found a comfortable working rhythm. At one point he said, without looking up from the bracket, "He doesn't trust me." "He doesn't know you," I said. "It's not quite the same thing." "No, but the second can fix the first." He handed me a lag bolt. "Can it?" I wasn't sure if it was a question or a statement. "I don't know," I said. "I think it depends on whether both people want to get there." He was quiet for a moment. What if one person doesn't particularly care whether they get there or not? Then you stop trying to make it work, and you focus on what you're actually there to do. He thought about that, tightened a bolt with a ratchet, 1 turn, 2 turns, a careful check of the tension. "She should have called her sons more," he said. "Probably. Her sons should have come out more." "Yes. And I should have come back sooner," not a question. A statement this time, plain and without sentiment. "Also yes," I said. We finished the gate and tested it. Smooth swing, solid latch, no movement in the hinge. There's a satisfaction to that particular kind of repair that I've never been able to fully explain to people who don't do this kind of work. The thing that was failing is no longer failing. You addressed the specific point of weakness and reinforced it without replacing the whole. The gate swings the same as it always did, looks the same as it always did, but underneath the bracket is solid and the post is whole, and it'll hold now through whatever comes. I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The week that followed, the 4 remaining days of Ricky's visit, was exactly as awkward as Nora had predicted, and also, gradually, something else. Ricky worked. That was what I hadn't anticipated. He showed up the first full morning in clothes that were going to be ruined by the end of the day, and he asked Dak what needed doing, and he did it. He wasn't skilled, grown up on a ranch, but it had been 25 years, and skills that aren't used deteriorate. But he was willing. And willingness, in my experience, is the more important of the two qualities because skill can be coached and willingness cannot. Dak was a patient teacher without being pedagogical about it. He showed rather than explained, which is the better method. He corrected without criticism, which is the harder skill. By the second day, I watched them work side by side for 20 minutes in the south pasture. Dak checking a calf that had a cut on its foreleg, Ricky crouching next to him asking questions that started out general, and then got specific as his interest sharpened, and something in the configuration, 2 men in a field doing something real, had a normalizing effect on the tension between them. They never had a conversation about Dak's history, as far as I know. Not directly. The kind of ground clearance that was needed between them happened, if it happened at all, sideways, through hours of shared work, through the particular democracy of physical labor, where what you can do matters more than your opinion about anything else. On the third evening, Ricky fixed a broken chair leg in the kitchen, the chair that had been leaning against the wall for what looked like years, because it was the one chair nobody needed. He worked on it at the kitchen table with a wood glue and a clamp, and a patience I hadn't seen from him before, and when it was done, he set it upright and sat in it carefully to test the weight. It held. He looked at it, then he looked at Nora. "That's been broken for a while," he said. "7 years," she said. He was quiet. "I kept meaning to get to it," she said. Not accusatory, just accurate. He nodded slowly, put the clamp away. "Mom, I'm sorry I don't," he stopped, tried again. "I'm sorry I don't come more." Nora was at the sink. She didn't turn around. "I know. That's not. I know it's not enough," she said, "but I appreciate that you know it." I was in the bunkhouse by then, but the door was cracked and I could hear this, and I'm only repeating it here because Nora told me the next morning that she didn't mind, that she wanted it recorded somewhere. That was her word. Recorded. She's the one who keeps the ledger, I remember thinking. She understands the value of things being written down. On his last morning, Ricky came out to the porch early, earlier than either Nora or Dak. I was already there with my coffee. He sat down in his mother's chair, not the empty one, and looked at the road. After a while he said, "Is he staying, Dak?" "I think so," I said. "Good," he said it flatly, but I thought he meant it. "Then she's different when he's around, more," he stopped. "She's more herself." I looked at the road. "That's not a small thing." "No," a pause. "I keep thinking I should feel something about it, proprietary maybe, but I don't, I just feel," he looked at the empty chair. "Relieved that she's not alone." I didn't say anything. "I'm going to call more," he said. "I'm going to actually try to do that, not just because I should, because," he ran a hand over his face. "Because I looked at her ledger last night, she showed it to me. She's been keeping it for years, every day, one line, and most of them said no one today. For years, most of them." I already knew about the ledger, but hearing him say it was different from reading it myself. "I didn't know," he said. "I thought I built this picture of her where she was okay, where she had her routine and she was managing. And she is, but she was also," he stopped again. "She was also alone every day, writing that in a book." "She's not alone today," I said. He nodded, looked at the road. "No, she's not." We sat there in the early light, Ricky in his mother's chair and me in mine, and the third chair between us was empty and neither of us said anything about it. The light came up slowly, gray going, pink going, gold, and somewhere in the south pasture a cow lowed, and from the direction of the draw there was a thin thread of smoke going up from the fire ring, which meant Dak was up early and had lit it. Ricky saw it too. He watched it for a while, that smoke, thin and straight in the still air. "What's that place?" he asked. "Old camp," I said. "Your father used to go there with the men who worked the ranch." He looked at it a long time. Dad knew about Apache traditions. Some, apparently, he learned. Ricky was quiet. Then, I didn't know that about him either. I let that sit. "There's probably a lot I didn't know," he said. "There's a lot about anyone," I said, "when you only knew them in one configuration." He thought about that. "What configuration did you know him in?" "I didn't know Earl at all," I said. "I'm going off what I've heard." He nodded. "What have you heard?" "That he was patient, that he knew how to sit with people and not try to fix them. That he had an unusual appetite for learning things that weren't required for anything." Ricky was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah," he said finally, "that's Earl." I left on a Friday. I'd been at the Sundown Ranch for 19 days, which was 17 days longer than the job had required, and 2 days shorter than I'd have liked, which is probably the right distribution when it comes to such things. Nora came out to the truck when I was loaded up. She stood on the top porch step, which put her slightly above eye level, and she looked at me with the direct, level attention I'd come to understand was her primary mode of engagement with things she took seriously. "You're going to want to leave your number," she said. "I already did. I left it on the kitchen table." She nodded. "Then you'll write it in your log." It was not a question. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment. The juniper moved in the light morning wind. From the barn, the sound of something being moved, Dak, starting the day's work. "I showed you the ledger," she said. You did. I don't show that to people. I know. She stopped, tried again. I wanted someone to know that it changes, that the ledger changes, that it said one thing for a long time and now it says something else. I wanted someone to see both. I understood, not as documentation, not as evidence, but as witness. She wanted someone to stand in the place where the before and the after were both visible, and to see them together and to understand the distance between them. I see them both, I said. She reached into the pocket of her canvas pants and held something out. A key, old brass, the kind that fits a mortise lock. Bunkhouse key, she said, spare. I looked at it. In case you find yourself between jobs again, she said. I took the key, held it for a moment. It was warm from her pocket. Thank you, I said. She nodded once and went back inside. I sat in the truck for a moment before starting it, looked at the porch, the two chairs, the blanket on one arm, the emptiness of the other, which was somehow less heavy than it had been when I arrived, as if something in the air around it had shifted. At the draw, the smoke was still going up, thin and straight. I put the key on the dashboard where I could see it, and I started the truck, and I drove the 1.5 miles of dirt track out to the county road. At the road, I stopped. Not long, maybe a minute, long enough to understand something I'd been circling for 19 days without quite landing. She drove to this road every evening at dusk, not because she thought Dak was coming, not because she was expecting anyone, but because the act of going to the limit of the property, going to the place where the ranch ended and the outside world began, was a way of remaining open, of keeping the possibility available, of refusing to close the gate all the way. He came back because she had kept it open. She had kept it open because she couldn't bring herself to close it, even when closing it might have cost her less. I thought about the bracket on the corral gate, the specific point of weakness, what it takes to reinforce something without replacing it. I turned left onto the county road and drove north, and in my rearview mirror the dirt track disappeared behind the junipers, and then I couldn't see it at all. But I knew what was back there. The two chairs on the porch, the fire ring in the drawer, the ledger on the kitchen table, and the entry for today that wasn't written yet, but that would be, that evening at the table in Nora Calvert's careful handwriting, something other than what it had been. I kept driving. The smoke country to the south had the light doing something strange to the Mogollon Rim again, deep copper orange even in the morning, and I pulled over for a minute and looked at it. Some things you need to see before they're gone. I took out my log and wrote a single line. Then I drove on,